I just hit the record button, so we are going to go ahead and jump in. So thank you all for joining us today. This is our Community of Practice Day 3, where we're going to focus in on planning and taking action, which is our first part 1 of that process. And we're going to be focusing on planning and delivering acceleration supports. And so very quickly, these are a picture of my 2 daughters. So the oldest one is Nasiah. This is a moment where both mom and dad were extremely exhausted, and the oldest daughter stepped in and said, "Look, I'll take the baby." She was yelling and screaming. She got the baby calm, and she even got her to sleep. So in the image you see, there's my oldest found her iPad and got some baby music playing, and my wife walked in and they were both knocked out sleep. So she took a picture. So I thought I would just share that. One quick fact about me, I enjoy listening to jazz, but I haven't listened to it as much in the last few, I guess, months or so. But just recently, as ways to try to help calm the baby, I've been listening to jazz a lot more. So I thought I would share that information. But quickly before we get started, if you guys have any questions or concerns, you feel free to shoot me a quick message in the chat. Just remember, if you send me a direct message, you'll have to go back and change the send out to everyone. So that way everyone sees the messages when we share out in the chat. Also, we will be accessing a few different resources today on the internet. So if you go to view options at the top, it'll allow you to exit full screen and then have seamless access to those web pages that we will use. And then the resources and everything for today's session will be shared very soon. And for whoever just joined us, welcome, welcome, welcome. And I just dropped a link in the chat so you can access the note catcher. All right. And so take a moment, if you haven't already done so, to access the note catcher. That way you have all the materials for today and you can follow along. If anyone is having any challenges accessing this tiny URL, just please let me know. I can drop the secondary link in the chat for you that'll give you direct access to the Google document. These are our same norms that we've always followed. So as much as possible, keep your camera on and be present. While you're not speaking, just keep your audio on mute to avoid any background noise. We will have a moment for us to join into a breakout room. So definitely collaborate with your colleagues during the breakout session. We'll leverage the chat feature early and often. We're going to do it in just a moment. So please use the chat feature when prompted. Katie, I just dropped the secondary link in the chat. Please let me know if that worked for you. And last but not least, I've already shared the materials, so we are good to go. So we are going to get started, and we're going to begin today with a reflection. And so I want you to think back to where you, as a youth, or maybe a young adult, decided to pick up a skill. So if you were younger, whether it be a sport, a musical instrument, or some artistic talent, wherever in your life that you decided to, pick up a skill, just wanted to think back to that moment and also think about the person who supported you, whether it be a coach or some type of instructor. And so what we would like you to do is, as you think back to that time, what are some of the actions that the coach or instructor took to support you in the development of this particular skill? So what I would like for us to do is take about 2 minutes, and I'll give everybody a chance to have some think time, and also to go ahead and start crafting their responses. After the 2 minutes, I'll prompt everyone to go ahead and share their thoughts out in the chat by hitting enter or return on their computers. We'll see if there's some common trends, and then we will move on. Excuse me. So we'll start with 2 minutes on the clock, and then we'll come back together. If you are ready, go ahead and start dropping your responses in the chat now. All right, so we see some responses in the chat. I think Nicole started us off, and I think the first idea that she dropped in the chat was very important. Like the person took some time to get to know you, to build that relationship, so there was trust um, that was established very early in the process, and then helping you identify what you need to work on and make yourself better, and also celebrating accomplishments along the way, um, highlighting the positives, and then giving examples and breaking down what was needed step by step. Lots of practice and scaffolds, regular and consistent feedback, the idea of being pushed outside our comfort zone, and forcing us to practice probably more often than we wanted to. Um, Modeled skills, provided rationale for adjustments, and provided consistent reinforcement. That comes up again. Um, in the moment feedback, another very important concept. So thinking about how in that moment where you did something that wasn't correct, here's how you could fix it, and then pushing you to move towards challenging tasks when they thought you were ready, tips for improvement, challenges to make you better. You see some more relationship building, as well as setting up structures for practice so you could get better at certain skills, and went over the key points that would help me get my desired results, ultimately helped me develop a routine that made me more consistent. And then after we started seeing results, it made it easier to trust the coach. And as a result, you became more coachable. All right. So thank you all for those responses in the chat. We definitely see some trends as it relates to the impact that a coach or instructor can have on an individual or a group of people. And so as we think about our work for today about supporting teachers with planning and taking action to support students with unfinished learning, we wanted you to think back to the impact that someone had in your growth and development around something that was important to you, because the exact same things that you all just lifted up as traits and qualities within a coach or instructor that allowed you to grow and develop, these are the same skills and qualities that you need to have as you support and coach your teachers, so then they can develop those qualities and then transfer those to our students. And so we want to make sure that those important factors that you lifted up are in the front of our mind as we do our work for today. And so we're also going to take a moment before we jump in to our work for today to reflect back on the pre-work that you were asked to complete after our last session together. So if you were a school-based leader, you were asked to collaborate to lead a common planning time meeting, whether that be with a single teacher or with a team of teachers, and the focus of that meeting was looking at student work. And if you were a district leader, you were asked to observe a common planning time meeting that focused in on student work. So if you refer to page 1 in your note catcher, you see these sets of questions that are at the top of your page. So we'll give you about 4 minutes of reflection time, and we'll do a quick stop and jot before we jump into our learning for today. So just want you to take some time to reflect back on that planning time that you observed or that you led, and identify what are some of the things that went well, and then what are some of the things that were challenging. Also, what are some of the things that you learned in the process, and what are some of the things that you want to keep doing, and what are some of the things that you might change. So what we'll do is we'll have 4 minutes total. After 2 minutes, I'll ask you to start dropping your responses in the chat to what are some of the things that any one of these sets of questions that you want to respond to. But we'll start by putting 4 minutes on the clock, and then I'll check back in and let you know when you can start sharing some responses. All right, you can go ahead and start sharing some of your responses in the chat. You still have about 90 more seconds before we'll come back together. All right, so Rebecca got us started. One thing she identified that went well was identifying teacher and student clarity to an issue around an issue to address the idea of breaking down the standards and effectively monitoring student progress. Is there anybody else that wants to share something that went well or something that was challenging or something that they learned as a part of the process? All right, they were able to identify issues with quality of assignments and demonstration of proficiency in meeting the standard. It's definitely a challenge talking people through the roadblocks they were seeing, like apathy or not completing work. A couple other challenges, recognizing that teachers needed some help to develop those skills to do that. And the reflection is need to be more prepared. Found a wide gap with in student mastery of standards to be frustrating. So we talked about how she might use small group instruction to meet the varied needs of students. All right, cool. So sounds like we had some successes and maybe even some struggles, which are okay. Working on outcomes to help focus student learning, also discuss more common assessments that are aligned to district checkpoints. All right. So thinking back to just like what we were talking about as it relates to your own experience with a coach or instructor, there's not always going to be these positive moments. There will be stumbling blocks and hurdles and challenges that you will face. And we know that if we're providing appropriate supports for our teachers, we will see the growth and development over time. So even if that first initial go round was challenging, sticking to the script and keeping, pressing that idea and keeping that positive attitude and mindset, you will see some changes and adjustments over time that I think will pay off dividends in your school buildings. So thank you all for sharing. And so very quickly, here's our focus for today. We're going to lean in on planning intentional acceleration supports. And what are we doing today? So if we think back to day one, we looked at the three key actions for acceleration. So first we need to understand where our focus area needs to be. The last time we were together, we looked at diagnosing the problem. So how do we, embed a formative assessment, unpack that formative assessment, analyze what students are bringing to the table. And now we're going to use that data and map out a plan, and then we're going to take action. Okay, so we're about to jump into our first session of planning acceleration supports. And so if we think back to Ms. Hutchins, who was our case study teacher, our 7th grade math teacher that we were looking at, when she did her diagnostic as it aligned to that 7th grade standard 7EEB4, we noticed that there were about 11 students who were ready to access that grade level content without any direct support. And she had 9 students who were in need of some intervention. So the idea or the focus point is to develop some small group instruction, and we'll see the plan that she creates and implements as a result of the looking at student work and unpacking that student work. And so very quickly, these are the key items that Ms. Hutchins identified as unfinished learning that her students had based on that diagnostic screener that she administered. I'll give you about 30 seconds to read through the different ideas on the screen before we move on. All right, so these are the key unfinished learning concepts that students needed the most support in. So we're going to see the approach that Ms. Hutchins took to support those students around these particular areas. But before we do that, just want to talk through a quick breakdown of how we want to support teachers with using quality instructional resources. So if you take a look at this bar graph on your screen, you'll notice that the 3 most used categories, or the 3 categories going from left to right in terms of where teachers pull resources for mathematics and ELA, it comes from Google, Pinterest, and Teachers Pay Teachers. And what we want to lift up today is that although these sites may have some quality resources, the one important thing about these resources is they're not vetted to ensure that there's alignment to our college and career readiness standards. Any individual can upload items to, Pinterest or Teachers Pay Teachers and tag a standard. And just because that standard is tagged doesn't necessarily mean that the work that students are doing are directly aligned to those resources. So what we want to do is we want to steer teachers towards resources that we know are high quality and are vetted. So we want to lean teachers towards resources that are more aligned to the work that they're doing, which is like the State Department of Education. So we want to just lift up this idea of using quality resources, also knowing that resources from other states can also be utilized and leveraged, as we saw during our last session together. And what we're going to do today is leverage another resource from the Louisiana Department of Education that will allow us to support our students with acceleration. And so we want to just jump in on our three core pillars of what we think needs to be in place in terms of quality instruction for acceleration. So we're going to jump in and talk about high quality instructional materials. And so something that's pretty new that's come out from the Louisiana Department of Education is they've created documents that support students with acceleration. And so there's a link on page 1 in your note catcher. I also just dropped that link in the chat. But let me just give you a quick overview of how the resources are utilized. So when you click on that link that I just dropped in the chat, you'll get a page that shows you a snapshot of what's on the left-hand side of your screen. And you'll see where it says Accelerate Math PDF. Once you click on that link, it's also a PDF that you can download that'll also hyperlink and take you to all these resources as well. But once you click on that link, you'll see an image that pops up on the right. And so what they've done is they've leveraged the grade level learning and identified the foundational prerequisite standards that are needed for success with the grade level learning. And what they've done is they've created PowerPoint or Google slide presentations that teachers can use in advance of giving students access to that grade level learning that's directly aligned to the prerequisite standards. And so as you notice, they have these resources available from kindergarten to 8th grade, and pre-K and high school resources are coming soon. So we're going to lean in and leverage the resources that are aligned to the 7th grade, because that is what we looked at in our last session together. And so very quickly, I want to give you a quick snapshot of how these resources are intended to be used. And so they're focused in on supporting students with that most essential prerequisite knowledge and skills. We spent a lot of time talking about how to identify the most applicable prerequisite. So some of the guesswork as it relates to these grade level standards, some of the heavy lifting has already been done for you. So that's the first key item of how these resources can be used. The other thing that's important is they were designed to be used outside of the math instructional block. So if you have like some intensive, like some support intervention time, or if you're doing tutoring either before school or after school, or maybe you have like a Saturday programming available in your district or in your schools, that is where these resources could be leveraged. They're set up to be 1 hour of virtual instruction, and there are 2 sessions a week. So when we click into these documents, there'll be one Google slide, but they'll be broken down into session 1 and session 2. The other key important factor is they're intended to be leveraged and utilized within small group. So, a maximum of 3 students who all have common needs. So leveraging the data from like a diagnostic to let you know where the students need that most support, and then go from there. A few things how we don't recommend to use these resources. First is thinking about intensive intervention. So if we need some intensive interventions for a student, then we should be following their individualized educational plan as opposed to using these resources. They should also not be used within a whole group, like in a classroom setting, as part of a mini lesson before each and every topic. Because if we're looking at it from that perspective, it would be a just in case approach versus a just in time approach, which we know is more efficient and more effective. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the 7th grade module 3, lessons 12 through 15. And as we go across left to right, the way you see the table organized is it gives you the grade level sessions that it's aligned to. It tells you the topics. It gives you the grade level standard. It tells you exactly where the materials are coming from that are aligned to that prerequisite learning. And then it gives you the resources. So in this particular case, there's a few Desmos activities that students are going to engage in. Students will also need either a whiteboard or loose leaf paper. right? And so oftentimes people may wonder if you aren't familiar with Desmos. Students do not need a Desmos account in order to access resources on Desmos. The teacher would need an account, but the accounts for teachers are free. And so we're going to jump into the resources that we've been describing. I am going to drop a link in the chat that will give you direct access to it. And so you could go through the page and navigate the way I said. So click on Accelerate Math, go to 7th grade Eureka, scroll down and identify the grade 7 module 3 learning. But I've streamlined that work for you, and you have the access to the link right there. So just take a moment and click on the link, so we can use that information as we jump into our first activity together. So what we are going to do is we're going to take some time to kind of go through these particular resources. And so as you're going through the resources, we have a couple of questions we want you to focus on. First and foremost, what are some of the things that you notice and wonder about these resources? And then second, how specifically does this content support Ms. Hutchins with addressing the unfinished learning that she diagnosed? So if you think about that list of the key things that we identified as unfinished learning within her student population, we want to see how these resources will directly support those things. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you 5 minutes to go through the resource that's you can access on the link that I dropped in the chat. After 5 minutes, I'll give us a few moments to kind of share in the chat what are some of the things that we notice and wonder about these resources. And then I would love for a few individuals to come off mute and share their voice in the space to answer the second question. How did this content support Ms. Hutchins with addressing the unfinished learning that she diagnosed? So I'm gonna start with putting 5 minutes on the clock. Please let me know if anybody is unable to access those resources, because I wanna make sure we're all on the same page before we jump into our 5 minutes of independent work time. All right, I'm taking the silence as everybody's good to go. So I'm gonna go ahead and put 5 minutes on the clock, and then we'll come back together and talk about some of the things that we notice and wonder. All right, let's take about 10 to 15 more seconds to finish up our reading. And as you are finishing up your reading, let's take the next 2 minutes to share in the chat some of the things that you noticed or wondered about these resources that you just read through. All right, so a few things that we've lifted up that we noticed that the digital activities were designed to engage students and increase their overall curiosity. Also noticed that the activities were chunked into small practice opportunities, allowing the teacher multiple opportunities to provide feedback, which we think is very important. It also allowed the students multiple opportunities to apply the feedback and continuously practice the targeted skill. All right. So if you have any other notices, feel free to drop the or wonders, feel free to drop those in the chat. So another one just dropped in. Notice that in the notes, they wrote down the conversation between the student and teacher to verify that the misconceptions are being addressed. Very important point as well. Notice the guided or shared problems do not always demonstrate the same level needed for independent practice. So example one, for example, the first example doesn't show examples with fractions and requires fractions in the independent practice. All right, that's definitely a good point. Are there any more notice or wonders that anyone wants to share? Feel free to continue to drop those in the chat. But I would love to hear from at least two individuals in response to the second question. So how does the content support Ms. Hutchins with addressing the unfinished learning that she diagnosed from the diagnostic screener? And so just very quickly, I'll go back to show you that list that we identified as the things that Ms. Hutchins recognized from the diagnostic that her students needed support with.
So as someone who supports English learners, what really stuck out to me was how she is providing more practice for students in translating words to those inequality symbols. So that's something that students are lacking. A lot of students come in with that skill, but that's going to stop them from making a lot of progress with the actual standard. So it gave them time to really build and practice on that foundational skill that they were missing.
Thank you for sharing that. Very important connection to identifying those equation and inequality symbols, because there was one that talked about equations as well. All right, is there anyone else who wants to share about how does this content support Ms. Hutchins with addressing the unfinished learning that she diagnosed? I see some head scratching, some of this. So I feel like there's someone that wants to share, someone else that wants to share. We've already had one person share. So looking for one more person to share their voice to the space before we move on.
I think one of the ones she talked about was the fact that the use of visuals was something that her kids needed. And throughout a lot of those resources, you saw a lot of that visual use to help out the kids as well.
Thank you, Chris, for sharing that. So it's another good point. So we noticed that these resources could provide the support that directly aligns to what Ms. Hutchins identified as where students have some unfinished learning. All right. And so very quickly, as we looked at, if you went through the first session, I know you only had about 5 minutes, so it's maybe a little challenging to get through all of the content, but a couple of key factors about these two sessions. So in the first session, students first jumped in to identify as was stated earlier, the symbols that are going to be used either as an equation or an inequality. They also spent some time recognizing or determining what a solution could be based on the equation or inequality. They also spent time determining when they could identify a value that was not a solution to the equation or inequality. So that gives them that opportunity. So if they see a problem and they're given, let's say, some error analysis, how they could then check their own work and then determine whether that value is actually a solution to that scenario. And then in session 2, they started by having students identify some of those key words that translates into those inequality symbols that kind of trip them up on the diagnostic screener. And then from there, they spent some time looking at some real world examples of just basic ideas about how you take a scenario and translate it into an inequality. Also, you had the visuals of the number line that showed the solutions that were available as part of the inequality. And then they jumped into some actual real world problems where they had to set up an inequality and actually solve it. So we noticed that as it connects to these ideas that we identified as unfinished learning, there were a lot of targets that were hit as a result of the use of these resources. All right. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to take a moment to look into what Ms. Hutchins is going to do as her plan of action. And so if you turn to pages 2, 3, and 4 in your note catcher, we're going to take some time to read through this planning for action part 1 case study. You'll have about 4 minutes to read through the case study. Then we're going to have our first breakout room. And in your breakout rooms, you'll have an opportunity to discuss with your colleagues these 2 questions. What do you notice about how Ms. Hutchins planned for acceleration? And then the second question is, how does the plan address the learning needs identified from the diagnostic screener student work? So I'll give you all 4 minutes to read through the case study on pages 2, 3, and 4. Then we'll come back together. I'll transition us into breakout rooms. You'll have about 8 minutes in your breakout rooms to discuss those 2 questions. And then based on the discussion in your breakout rooms, we'll have a few individuals share their voice to the space again to share some of the conversation that took place in the breakout rooms. So we'll start with the 4 minutes and we're reading pages 2, 3, and 4, the planning for action part 1 case study. All right, so hopefully that was enough time for you to read through the planning for action case study. I'm going to transition us into breakout rooms so we can so we can have a discussion around these two questions. So you two are back. So someone's going to share out first from this group.
Yeah, we can share out. I got some really good advice from Nicole just done.
Perfect. All right. All right, so welcome back from the breakout rooms. Had a chance to pop into every room and heard some great conversations. We're going to start with group one, who's going to share some of the insight that they, as part of their discussion, and then looking for one other group to share before we move on. So go ahead, the floor is yours, group one.
Yeah, so we discussed talking about, she planned for acceleration by first identifying the learning needs. And we thought that was really wonderful. And then we did delve a little bit deeper. So like Nicole is middle school and I'm high school. And just that we want to make sure that even in between courses, we're addressing needs that will need to be addressed next year. So for example, a kid going from algebra 1-2 to geometry still might have some unmet learning needs. And instead of holding those kids back, we want to continue them on their path. And that this just might be a really good way for us to keep an open line of communication, to plan those accelerations by just calling them refresher assignments. So then you can see where your student needs are, but still make sure they're on track in geometry while maybe brushing up on some things that might have gotten a little left behind this year in COVID. So that's what we discussed.
All right, thank you, group one. So now looking for one other group to share their voice to the space. Just feel free to come off mute and just share some of the conversation that happened in your group.
Well, I can share a little bit out about one thing that Kristen mentioned in our group was that the teacher kind of changed up, like met with this group for 2 weeks or this group for 1 week. And Kristen, feel free to jump in if you want to explain that more. But the only thing I want to mention is that it also, I think all of this proves why the teacher is so important, because some of this work a program could not do, and making some of those decisions for how long a group needs to be with it or kind of brought back, or Ms. Hutchinson when she needed to plan for acceleration. So I just wanted to add that point in.
So thank you for that. So we had responses from two groups. And I think both responses lean in and share the impact and value of the resources and the approach that Ms. Hutchins took as it relates to first diagnosing, using the formative assessment to identify the unfinished learning, and then using that data to craft the plan to support her students and the timing of it. And so we noticed a couple of things that are important as it relates to planning considerations. I also heard a group talk about like the scheduling and how the schedule may not necessarily permit an intervention block something outside of the core math instructional time. So those are like conversations that if you are a school leader, you can start to craft and think through if you can map out some intervention time in the master schedule. And that is a logistical challenge that, some schools have and aren't able to address. So thinking about a couple of key considerations. So we know that the grouping was very strategic because it was students aligned to common learning needs. They had similar strengths and weaknesses, also thinking and taking into account like student schedules. So when those students will be available to receive this support. Also, we know this was done as an additional add-on outside the core math block. And it was a just-in-time approach because it was done concurrently with the grade level learning. So Ms. Hutchins mapped out how she was going to support her kids in advance of teaching this grade level content to ensure students were able to access that 7th grade content when it was delivered in the whole class instruction. And the last part, the content was high quality. We know it was an aligned resource and it was tied to the needs of the students. And so we know that there are some intentional structures that are in play as we looked at this case study example. And so we just want to lift up this idea that, as you're thinking about next year and, future years, what type of intentional structures could you put in place to allow this type of learning to happen. And where you can, find wiggle room, we're just pushing for you to kind of think through those strategic moments where you can identify opportunities for students to gain some intervention. And so we also want to take a moment to think and look at some whole group acceleration or whole class acceleration support examples. And so if we look at the first problem that Ms. Hutchins gave in the diagnostic formative assessment, we recognize that only one student was able to show clear evidence of mastery, and a lot of her students were unable to show evidence of learning within that question. So in that moment, as needed or warranted by the data, there could be a whole class acceleration support that could happen. And so we're going to take a look at a few examples of that now. And so in your note catcher, if you turn to pages, we're going to start on page 5. And what we're going to do is look at a series of examples of how we could support our class as it relates to a whole class support. So when the data warrants the whole class needs an intervention, here's some of the ways that we could do it. So if you turn to page 5, the first example has the teacher embedding a warm-up over the course of a week. So there are 4 different warm-ups that you see that the teacher would embed. And then at the end of the week, the teacher would reassess to see how well the students, internalize the information and the content over that week to see if students are ready to be able to move on with that learning. The second example is just pulling a problem from the grade level learning and embedding it as part of the learning that's happening. And then as a follow-up, there would be a discussion that takes place. So thinking about what are some of the similarities and differences about this open-ended problem that students are given. And this is on page 6. On page 7, in this opportunity, the teacher leveraged the use of the prerequisite knowledge and went back into the 6th grade standard and identified a lesson where the students were going to engage in some station activities. And those 4 different station activities were strategically set up that were aligned to those foundational prerequisite knowledge that students needed as related to that question. And the last example also was leveraging the 6th grade prerequisite standards. And this is something very similar that we saw within the Accelerate lesson, where they pulled out where the students were engaged in those real world scenarios and have to use and apply those inequality symbols to make the connection between what's being stated in the real world and how that could fit into the solution or the visual graph of the inequalities. So those are the 4 different samples that are available. I kind of just walked you through them so you have a clear understanding of them. And then what I'm gonna do now is give you about 3 minutes to kind of go through and then do a little deeper glance of those 4 examples. And as you are analyzing those examples, if you see something that pops in your brain about like the first question, what are some commonalities that you notice across these examples? As these ideas are coming to you, go ahead and drop them in the chat. Also, if something comes up as it relates to the second question, how does each example address the whole class unfinished learning that Ms. Hutchins diagnosed within the core math block? If you see a response or you have a response to that question as you're reading, go ahead and drop that in the chat as well. So I'm going to give us actually 4 minutes, so about a minute to kind of read through each of the examples. And then we'll kind of just leverage the chat in this situation, and then we'll come back together. So we have 1 more minute. If there are any other reflections around either one of these questions, just drop those in the chat as they come up before we move on. All right, thank you, Luke, for dropping your response in the chat. Are there any other responses? Oh, Nicole just dropped one as well. So Luke said the examples capture the student's individual thinking process during the learning process and identifies where students go wrong and allows the teacher or the group to capture the error when it occurs in the reteach. Also, the multiple representations give opportunities for group and partner discussion and identifies the flawed learning. Any other thoughts that anybody wants to add before we move on? So we just use this example to recognize that in the moment when needed, a lot of times you may need to do a whole class report. So we just wanted to share a few different approaches on how that could be leveraged. So we saw a variety of different strategies, but all are tied and geared towards giving students the access so they'll be able to create and solve like a one-step equation. So we looked at multiple ways that learning could take place. And so the key takeaway from this whole section is that the success that the teacher was able to have is a result of very intentional planning. And so we know what happens when we don't create a well-crafted plan. We know things break down. And then when, because we all know that we've had those moments in classrooms where even though we're well planned, things happen that we hadn't anticipated. But because we had a plan, we were much more able to adapt and adjust in that moment versus when we didn't have a plan and things just fell flat. And oftentimes, if you've ever observed a classroom where a teacher was not well planned and things started happening that kind of derail the lesson, it's very obvious to both both an observer and the students are aware of it as well. And so Courtney just added in the chat, this also helps the teacher break down student responses to understand their learning and to what degree they're learning the content. So another good point as well. So we're now going to jump into delivering acceleration supports and monitoring progress. And so we have two case studies that we want you to read. And so we have one from Ms. Hutchins. And so we'll see how Ms. Hutchins maps out a plan to deliver her acceleration supports. This is on pages 10 and 11. And then on page 12, you have another case study that's very short. And this is done by a teacher by the name of Ms. Fields. And this is, two different examples of how two teachers would deliver these acceleration supports. So I just want you to take the next 5 minutes to read through both examples. So the first one's on page 10 and 11. The second one's on page 12. And then we'll come back and discuss like some of the things that stood out to you about both teachers' approaches and what the overall impact of both teachers' instructional delivery would have on the students' overall math experience. Take one more minute to finish up the reading of these two case studies. If you all are ready now, just let me know. All right, so as we read these two case studies, I think you clearly identified a strong difference between the two. So what are some of the things that you noticed about what's the two approaches or delivery between Ms. Hutchins and Ms. Fields? Just get somebody to come off mute very quickly to share their thoughts.
I think that in Ms. Hutchins' delivery, the students helped to bear the cognitive load of like even unpacking what she was going to teach for the day and explaining their thinking. I didn't quite finish Ms. Fields, but I could tell from the start that, you know, it was kind of like, here's what we're going to be doing now. Go get your materials and let's get started.
Yeah, so definitely thank you for sharing that. So thank you for sharing, Monica. So Ms. Hutchins was very student-centered, where the students were doing the cognitive lift, and Ms. Fields was very teacher-centered. And so I'm just looking for someone else to share. Luke, was that you wanting to share?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I really like the work on the first teacher, Miss I think it was Hutchins, right? No, it was, I don't remember the first one. But she was really using that neuroscience approach, really starting to build the students' confidence and understanding about what they did well. And I think that really has a strong connection in terms of, or at least research kind of points it toward that. And I would attest to that as well. But it really builds that confidence and sense of learning, that they're going to be a progressional learner. They're going to pick up new skills, and it's showing that they retain information as well. So as they're doing those collaborative conversations, they already know, hey, yeah, I can do this well, or we're identifying different components. So as they went through those collaborative conversations, they had a little bit of confidence to do that conversation, as opposed to just saying, hey, let's go collaborate and have a conversation. So I think she really pre-built that to work well. You know, obviously I don't know the results, but I think that does all play into it in the end.
Thank you for sharing that. And so Nicole dropped in the chat, Ms. Hutchins allows students to use a discovery method. They were able to try, explore, and discuss, and the teacher could identify processes and ideas. So we know that Ms. Hutchins was the facilitator of knowledge. And so she guided the students in their discovery and in that lesson that she designed, as opposed to Ms. Fields, she was just telling students what they needed to do. And so now providing the opportunity for students to support each other, but rather just Ms. Fields just gave students the answers in some cases. And so I always think back to which class would I want my child to be in. So I would definitely want my child to be in Ms. Hutchins' class versus Ms. Fields' class, because that's a more enjoyable learning experience. And when kids are engaged, they're definitely going to learn more. And so we know that this goes directly in line with our third bucket, which is effective instruction. And so to talk about effective instruction, we lean in on the NCTM effective math teaching practices. This is something that has been out for a while. I'm going to drop the link in the chat that will take you to this resource. But we know that if we looked at Ms. Hutchins, her lesson as compared to Ms. Fields, we see a lot of these key things. So there was meaningful discussion. She posed purposeful questions. She clearly had a goal that she set at the beginning of the lesson to allow the kids to engage in that learning. The task was created so that it could promote reasoning and problem solving. It also had an opportunity to connect to multiple representations. And it was clear evidence that she was using the students' thinking to advance the conversation and to advance the lesson itself. So we know that we want to definitely leverage these key instructional, these math teaching practices as some of the things we want to embed and have our teachers grow and develop around. And so our key takeaway when delivering acceleration supports is we want to build that conceptual understanding that students need to access the grade level learning by ensuring that students are actively involved in the making meaning of the mathematics. This an engaging environment where students can have meaningful discussions that give them multiple opportunities to share their thoughts and ideas. That's also very important because it it acknowledges the students as learners, and it allows the students to bring the information that they already know to the table, and then the teacher and then their classmates can add on and expand upon that knowledge. So it doesn't say, hey, you don't know anything when you come into the classes, versus we want to hear what you have to say and we want to hear your thinking. And now I'm just going to, once I know what you know, I'm going to help guide you and move you towards the grade level learning that we need. And so posing purposeful questions to assess and advance student thinking is another key point. And so one other thing to notice is that when we're thinking about effective instructional practices, we want to ensure that the teacher's actually monitoring what is going on in the classroom. And so I have a sample monitoring tool that Ms. Hutchins used as she was delivering this instruction to her students. You see a screenshot of it very quickly, but I dropped the link in the chat. We are getting close to the end of our time together, but I do want you to take a quick minute or two just to go look at this this monitoring tool, because if you're thinking about how we go about ensuring that teachers are using and assessing student evidence and data and using that actively as part of the learning process, a teacher must be monitoring the conversations and the things that students are doing. So they must be circulating the room. They should have some type of monitoring tool where they're able to quickly grab some holistic notes, so then they can use those notes to then do things like leverage the conversation. So determining who's going to lead first in the conversation based on the responses that are happening within the small groups. So I'll give you guys a quick minute or two to kind of analyze this monitoring tool to see the approach that Ms. Hutchins took to support her students. So as you're analyzing this monitoring tool, you'll see that Ms. Hutchins is very strategic about how she is monitoring her students' progress. So she's identifying who's on pace, who's making progress and who's not making progress, what clear evidence she's using as to how she's making this determination. She has some notes about what each student is actually doing, and she also has identified those next steps. So a tool like this is something that she's leveraging within those small groups, which is allowing her to take these quality and detailed notes in that environment. And so this quote just speaks to the importance of classroom instruction, and I'll give us a moment, give you all a moment to read this quote. So I know that in my practice, one of the things that I push my teachers to consistently do is constantly check for understanding. And that's a moment where they can monitor and determine where students are moving towards that overall learning target or learning goal for today. And so another key thing, like especially with us being virtual, our focus is always providing students with as many opportunities to show their thinking within one particular period of time. And so we use a lot of resources where the teacher can in real time check to see what students are doing and provide that real time feedback. So if we were in the classroom, they would be actively monitoring, circulating the room. But because we're completely virtual, we use resources like Desmos or whiteboard.fi or like a smart learning suite. All these resources and tools allow the teachers to see in real time what the students are doing as it relates to their work. and then allows the teacher to provide that feedback and support so students can make those quick shifts and corrections while they're working. And so we know that that key math practice of eliciting student and using student evidence to monitor progress, it has these key factors. It definitely allows us, when we're thinking about supporting students within our acceleration blocks. So we know using student work from the tutoring sessions, leveraging the embedded curriculum resources, and looking for evidence to make decisions about grouping. So also we noticed that when students were excelling, she didn't continue to keep them in the small group intervention. If they only needed one session to be successful, then she had clear evidence to say why they didn't need a second session. And so we want to make sure we're being very strategic about how we support our students as it relates to acceleration. So our key takeaway is, how do we know if the teaching that's happening in the classroom is equating to learning by the students? We must effectively and consistently monitor student work. And so we are pretty much at the end of our time. This 90 minutes goes by pretty quickly. And so we have next steps for you. If you are a school-based leader, we would like for you to select one teacher to support with planning just-in-time acceleration supports, whether that be whole group or small group, based on the data that this teacher has collected. If you are a district-based leader, we're asking you to observe the co-planning session and or observe the teacher's instruction that's happening as it relates to these acceleration supports. Our next session together will be our last session, where it'll be a team planning summit, where we'll focus in on looking ahead to next school year and beyond. And just want to say thank you for your engagement and sharing out your thoughts and ideas to the space today. I just dropped the link in the chat, so both links will take you to the same resource. So if you're unable to access the tiny URL, just click on the second link. Just want to say thank you again, and I'll stick around for a few minutes to see if anyone